absolutely fearsome in combat, incredibly well disciplined, and highly organized. The Roman army was arguably the most brilliant military force in the history of warfare, and this was no more clear than in its largest unit, the Roman legion. But what was it that turned men from farms and villages into true fighting machines? What did the Romans achieve that other societies didn't, or at least as effectively? That's what we're going to uncover today. When we're talking about the armed forces of Rome, we're diving into a very intricate topic. Things evolved a lot during the lifespan of Rome. The Roman kingdom dates back to the 8th century BC. Then you had the Roman Republic from 500 to 31 BC, and after that, all the way until 395 AD, the Roman Empire. Many aspects of the military changed over those centuries, from the size of the army to its tactics, to its weapons, and to how it was structured. But even though it was such a long stretch of time, many of the foundations of the military stayed very similar. If you were to ask when its prime was, you'd get plenty of different answers. But many people in the know might say it was under the great Julius Caesar, who you'll remember played a major role in the Republic becoming the Empire. So, today, when we're talking about the Roman legion, just keep in mind that a few key things shifted over time. Typically, around the era of Caesar and just before. The legion would consist of anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 men, and they'd be split into units. The vast majority of men were part of the infantry, and fewer soldiers served as cavalry. There were also non-Roman mercenaries fighting alongside the legion. There were many reforms within the Roman military, especially during the period of the late Republic, when Rome was expanding, fighting among itself, and constantly at war. Rome excelled at war partly because it had so much practice in it. In the time of the late Republic, the army became more professional. When under the statesman Gaius Marius, there were what we now call the Marian reforms. Before the reforms, men fought in the military, but when the various campaigns ended, off they went back to wherever they'd come from. This was not ideal in terms of maintaining a professional army. These men were divided into classes, and since the poorest couldn't afford to buy their swords and other gear, they were not expected to hold the battle line. The higher classes had better weapons and more armor, and these men might have become extremely valuable veterans with a lot of experience. They certainly held the battle line. They were the top tier of fighting and strategy, and that's what the Romans under the new reforms wanted all their soldiers to be. There were still ranks, though. The detailed ranking of men is a thing in any military still today. At the top of the classes was the cavalry, usually made up of wealthy Roman men who could afford a horse and the finest equipment. It goes without saying that when all these men were fighting for Rome, they were accompanied by a large contingent of servants and slaves to work in the camps. There were even specialist artisans who could build you a decent abode for when you were on the road. But we said that kind of setup wasn't ideal during a time of great expansion and war, so the reforms created a permanent army, an army that knew what killing was like, an army that didn't head back home after battle. It also meant all men who joined the legions could retire with some land. Dedicating much of their life to the military sometimes paid off, and so plenty of men wanted to be in the legion. Okay, so how did a man join the legion? Firstly, he had to be a Roman citizen. There were non-Roman soldiers who fought alongside the legion called the auxilia, who might gain citizenship one day, but the new recruits were all Romans. Step one for them was proving their citizenship, and only then could they start the process of being checked out. This process was called the probatio, which of course, we can think of as a probation stage. It ensured the person was legally Roman and that he wasn't lying about his age. Most recruits were typically aged between 17 and 23. The Romans were eager to have men that looked physically strong and healthy. They didn't have a clue about genetics, but they had an idea of what you might call prime fighting stock. You would have struggled to get into the legion if you were seriously overweight, or if you were as skinny as a beanpole. There was also a medical inspection. There are papyrus records from the year 52 AD that tell us about a weaver that had first gotten into the Legion, but then was removed because of his weak eyesight that was caused by a cataract. Seems Steve Rogers would have needed a super soldier serum to make it into the Roman Legion as well. They wanted strong men, often tall men, no shorter than 173 centimeters 5 feet 7/8. It seems the height rule changed over the years, and it also seems that if you were muscular and short, that would be taken into account. Still, they definitely preferred taller kinds of guys. The records show that strong backs and broad shoulders were also favored. Remember, these men would be going through hell. They'd be doing heavy lifting, marching for miles and miles carrying the gear we'll talk about soon, and then fighting in battles. The Romans only wanted the best type of men for this, and this pickiness is another reason why their armed forces were so great. The man's background was also taken into account. The Romans understood that his upbringing could affect how good he was at being a soldier. They favored guys that had sweated it out in the countryside, living a tough, rural life that had hardened them. These folks were usually better recruits than the city kid who had lived a relatively easy life. They wanted kids that were used to going hungry, that knew what labor felt like. We get most of our knowledge on recruitment for the legions from an ancient work known as Epitome Re Militaris, written by a Roman writer named He went into detail about what went on in the Roman army, but was mostly talking about the early empire. As you know, we're discussing post-Marius reforms today, so the late Republic and early empire. We should tell you that Mr. Vecchides may have idealized how great the army was, but let's face it, the results speak for themselves. Sure, the legions got beaten now and again, such as when they were destroyed, and we mean annihilated, in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9, but they were victorious a lot more than they had their behinds handed to them. Moving forward, as you know, the Romans discriminated heavily when picking their recruits. They certainly didn't have human resources offices talking about equality and fairness. The Romans were often prejudiced and geographist, believing that young men from more temperate climates would be better soldiers than those from hotter climates. Skin tone mattered to some extent. They wrongly thought folks who had grown up with harsh winters would be better men on the battlefield than those used to warmer weather. Still, maybe they had a point, as the legionnaires often had to campaign in dreadful weather conditions. Vegetius said, what job the young kid had before also counted, saying soldiers who'd been hunters, or maybe blacksmiths, were preferred over people who'd had, let's say, less rugged jobs, such as weaver. He said, a butcher would make a better soldier than a cook would. Yup, outright discrimination. How did they know a cook wasn't tough as nails and kicking butts when he wasn't making stuffed dates fried in honey? That was apparently a favorite dish of some Romans. It wasn't all about brawn, though. Brains also counted. The texts tell of a recruit named Julius Apollinarius in 107 AD, who it said was able to join the legion and get a cushy position as a clerk librarius after he'd handed in a letter of recommendation. He wrote to his father and said he was lucky not to be outside with the other guys who were all breaking rocks, maybe for some building project. A good recruit would show that he could think on his feet. Roman texts even talk about men having lively eyes, which was thought to mean a quick-thinking brain. This is why the Romans valued the level of literacy in their recruits. It not only showed intelligence, but it helped since the Roman armies always kept records of what they'd done, where they'd been, and how things had gone. It goes without saying that if you were tall and built like a barge, but couldn't read or write, you might get a different job from a genius built like a broom. The book Gladius, The World of the Roman Soldier, explains that many men would keep records, and sometimes when a fellow soldier died, they'd write his details on his tombstone. This didn't mean everyone was educated. You could be of the lower class, a plebeian, and still join the ranks of the legion, which was a way to improve your standing. That's why many uneducated men entered the legion. We should add that some historians have talked about men joining up to escape prosecution or a life of crime, and there were many petty criminals in the legions. Still, if you'd committed a serious crime, there's little chance they'd have let you in. The same goes for most militaries today. Recruits who were seen as having a good sense of humor or able to hold sway in talks with other men were also favored. That's because when it came to long campaigns, they could keep morale up when men were down in the dumps. No army wants a constant complainer whose glass is always half empty when people are dying left, right, and center. Being smart as a whip and personable might help if you were not as tall or strong as some of the other guys. So, one major reason why the Roman legion was so powerful is each recruit was sized up first and told to buzz off if he didn't suit the criteria. It goes without saying that we don't know how strict this was, and if hiring standards didn't get lax when men were needed for campaigns. We know there are records of some prominent ancient Romans complaining that the military was recruiting way too many driftos. The training was definitely no walk in the park. It was usually 4 months of hell and was meant to prepare a young guy for the ravages of campaigns. It wasn't all physical, though. Remember that the Romans were famous for their strategy and tactics, which would shift depending on the era. The recruits had to learn how to wage war, not just be able to fight in them. They had to learn all the formations of the day. You've probably all seen one formation called the testudo, the tortoise. The men formed a shell that made it hard to be attacked, and then, when the time was right, they burst out of their shell. We won't go into all the formations today, but we'll say that training recruits to master a bunch of them gave the Romans an edge in battle. During the late Roman Republic, legions were divided into cohorts of 480 men, what you could compare to battalions in the modern sense of the word. The entire legion during this period would usually be about 10 cohorts, with the first usually consisting of the most seasoned men and the least experienced being the 10th one. That would mean after passing training, you'd generally join number 10, but not always. It depended on your skills. Before those reforms came about, a cohort would be split into centuria, 100 soldiers, and each of these was commanded by a centurion, who were also ranked by experience. After the reforms, some things changed, the numbers for one thing, but the general divisions stayed similar. There were lots of different ranks, and we won't talk about them all. Just know that the centurion that led the men was extremely important. He was the lodestone, keeping men disciplined and battle-ready. What's important is that each cohort had a set of equipment that the men should all be familiar with. This included their own weapons, which we'll discuss soon, but also often siege weapons that could hurl heavy objects for use in breaking enemy fortifications. These weapons changed over the years, but the systems stayed very similar. It's thought that during the late Republic, the Romans were not all that advanced as far as war machines were concerned. Recruits would be trained how to scale walls and use battering rams, but technical skill in terms of machine use was not high on the list of things to learn. Still, machinery was used during sieges, and the recruits had to know how to handle them. But much of the training would simply be marching. That's right, marching all day long until their feet were sore as hell. The reason is obvious. There was no other way they could get to a battle than walking, so they practiced walking until they practically walked themselves to near death. But marching also taught them how to hold formation. It taught discipline. Any soldier will tell you that marching in formation is still a very important part of being a soldier today. It not only fosters synchronicity between large groups of men, but it also makes men familiar with following orders all day long. For the Romans, it ensured that when they did finally march towards battle, the men stayed in formation, and none got lost or, for some reason, disappeared. It was quite common during training for men to march 20 miles a week, which might not sound like much, but they could be carrying around 20 pounds of gear while going over some rather rough terrain. They were also often told they had to complete a set distance within 5 hours. Sometimes extra distance was added, and the men had to march quicker. This was on top of all the other training, so trudging over mountains would often happen when the men were already exhausted. What also made it so tough is they would practice marching in full armor, something you've likely seen in the movies. They might also be carrying their shield, the scutum, or wearing their helmet, the auxilia. On top of that, they might have a javelin on them, as well as their short sword, the gladius, and a dagger pugio, tucked into their belt. We can't be certain how all the practice marches took place, but it is clear recruits at times would also have to carry a backpack sarcina, possibly containing food, water, and equipment to set up camp. Now 20 miles over a mountain doesn't sound all that simple, does it? It's worth noting here that training in the cold was seen as a good thing, since it toughened a recruit up and was thought to promote good health. Still, if it was too cold, the men trained in large structures built for various kinds of practice. Year-round training gave the Romans a clear edge in battle. A weak immune system, even though they had no clue what an immune system was not ideal when marching many miles in the winter for a scrap. This is why the men also had to show they were strong swimmers, not only because being able to cross water was important, but being able to endure freezing cold water made the recruits tougher and what the Romans believed was less prone to illness. They were probably right. What doesn't kill you can make you stronger. They fully embraced this adage many years before Friedrich Nietzsche made it famous. Training sure could get a recruit down, and that's why so much of the training wasn't just based on following orders, but also on building camaraderie among the men. In battle, this would be very important. There was some fun in training, and certainly lots of fun once in the Legion. R&R was just as vital as it is for troops now. It should be said that legionnaires weren't supposed to get married by law, but many had families anyway. They also learned that if they should ever turn away from a fight once recruited, the result might be being beaten to death by the guys you'd shared jokes with in training. Nothing makes a soldier braver and more willing to fight than good bonds, or the threat of being stoned or cudgeled to death by your closest friends. Even falling asleep on lookout duty could mean a very serious beating, or death if those 50 winks had dire consequences. As far as the fighting practice was concerned, the men trained with javelins, which were very effective weapons. These short-range tools could be used with great accuracy after weeks of training. They weren't very heavy and could be thrown quite a distance, helping soften up an enemy before hand-to-hand combat. Recruits were also taught to be skilled swordsmen, learning how to use thrusts and controlled slashes when needed so they wouldn't harm the brother next to them. Then there were the slings, a weapon that was actually very important. These could be used from a distance, whereby a stone would be launched through the air. Again, each recruit, over the 4 or so months of training, would be taught how to use these with remarkable accuracy. They were cheap yet effective, taking the place of archers, which weren't very common in ancient Roman armies. Once the slings and the javelins had been used, that's when the men could advance with swords and spears. All this was practiced again and again in drills, often with the help of gladiators. Drills came first, and sparring came afterward. Interestingly, the wooden weapons they used in training were often heavier than the ones they'd wield in real battles. This strengthened the men's muscles, boosted their speed, and improved accuracy. Once they got the real thing in their hands, it felt almost weightless. If the recruits complained, or worse, spoke out of turn, or attacked someone, the punishment could be brutal. It could mean anything from being forced to sleep outside in the cold, to being beaten with sticks, or even stoned. Still, if they were well-behaved recruits, they usually earned praise and honors. Some scholars have said the fear of being beaten to death was a stronger motivator than a pat on the back when it came to avoiding cowardice or laziness. We haven't said much about cavalry training, only because after the Republic, the cavalry was mostly made up of the auxilia we mentioned earlier. They were trained similarly to the legionaries, except, of course, Marching was replaced with riding, and the formations were different. There were plenty of them too, as time went on, since they included many conquered tribesmen, especially from the Gallic provinces. Alongside them, also fighting with the Legionnaires, were archers from as far away as North Africa. Usually, after 4 months of training, sometimes as many as 6 months, the recruits could graduate and be sent to their assigned legion. They swore an oath to the legion and their emperor, although unlike what some scholars have claimed, it's unlikely they were branded or given a tattoo to show they were now a legionnaire. That kind of thing was usually for criminals, although it's not impossible that some recruits got inked. They each received a signiculum, an inscribed lead tablet they could wear around their necks. Think of it like dog tags. Even while in service, life wasn't only about campaigns. They often enjoyed downtime, although when the empire was in full swing, if not on a campaign, they were usually busy working on projects like roads, dams, or other infrastructure. And if there was no work in that area, policing the people was another of their duties. As the saying goes, all for the glory of Rome. The legionnaires might serve for 20 or 25 years, and if they survived, would likely enjoy a comfortable life with land and wealth. That's why many signed up in the first place. But records show that only 40 to 50% of legionnaires lived to reach retirement. Now, you need to watch why you wouldn't survive living in the Roman Empire, or check out the insane real life of a Roman gladiator.